This is a cinematic, fictionalized story based on the premise provided, not a verified historical account of an actual confrontation on Johnny Carson's show. The audience was laughing. Johnny Carson was in complete control. The cameras were rolling. Bruce Lee was smiling. Then Bill Wallace leaned forward and said 6 words that nobody in the studio expected to hear. "I don't think you can beat me." The laughter died. Not slowly, not naturally. It vanished. Hundreds of people suddenly stopped smiling at exactly the same moment. Johnny Carson looked at Wallace. Then he looked at Bruce Lee. Bruce didn't move. For several seconds, he simply stared at the man sitting across from him. No anger. No insult. No raised voice. Nothing. Then Bruce smiled. And somehow, that smile made the room even quieter, because everyone was waiting for Bruce Lee to answer. Wallace had just challenged the reputation of one of the most talked-about martial artists in America. But Bruce's answer would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It would be 4 words. 4 words that would turn a television interview into something nobody expected. Then find out. And what happened after those words would make even Johnny Carson stop joking. The night had started normally. Bright studio lights poured across the stage. The audience was packed. The band was ready. Cameras moved smoothly between Carson and his guests. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk, smiling with the relaxed confidence of a man who knew exactly how to control a live audience. He could turn silence into laughter. He could turn an awkward moment into comedy. He could make famous people feel comfortable enough to forget the cameras were there. And that night, his guests were almost impossible to ignore. Bruce Lee sat on one side. Bill Wallace sat nearby. 2 martial artists, 2 completely different reputations. Bruce Lee had become a phenomenon. People talked about his speed, his technique, his philosophy, his demonstrations, his ability to make complicated movements appear effortless. But what fascinated people most was the contradiction. He didn't look like the stereotypical giant fighter. He wasn't built like a heavyweight. He didn't need to be. There was something about his eyes, something about the way he watched people, something about how still he could become. Across from him was Bill Wallace. Superfoot. Wallace had built his own reputation through speed, flexibility, timing, and extraordinary kicking ability. He wasn't interested in celebrity. He was interested in fighting. And Wallace had a belief that separated him from the people sitting in the audience. He believed every fighter could be tested. Every fighter could make a mistake. Every fighter could lose. Even Bruce Lee. Especially Bruce Lee. At first, however, none of that was visible. Carson joked. Bruce smiled. Wallace laughed. The audience relaxed. Then Carson leaned toward Bruce. "Bruce, they tell me you're incredibly fast." Applause. Bruce nodded. Carson looked toward Wallace. "And Bill here has a reputation for being pretty fast himself." Wallace smiled. The audience laughed. Carson grinned. "Pretty fast?" Wallace nodded. "Very fast." More laughter. Then Carson looked between them. His smile widened. And he asked the question. "If you 2 ever fought." He paused. The audience leaned forward. "Who would win?" The studio exploded with laughter. Bruce smiled. Wallace leaned back. Carson waited. Bruce didn't answer immediately. He looked at Wallace, then at Carson. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know." The audience laughed again. Carson raised his eyebrows. "You don't know?" Bruce nodded. "You cannot know what happens in a fight before it happens." The audience applauded. Carson smiled. It was a perfect answer. Calm, reasonable, impossible to attack. But Wallace wasn't laughing. He was watching Bruce. His expression had changed. He leaned forward. Or maybe, he paused. "You don't want to say." The audience became quieter. Carson looked at Wallace. "Bill," Wallace continued, "people think Bruce Lee is unbeatable." Bruce remained silent. "They see him on television." Wallace gestured toward the cameras. "They see the demonstrations." Then he pointed toward Bruce. "And they start believing nobody can touch him." Bruce didn't react. Wallace smiled. "I don't believe that." A few people laughed nervously. Carson tried to rescue the moment. "Well, Bill, I think we're still trying to keep this a friendly television program." The audience laughed, but Wallace wasn't finished. "No disrespect," he looked directly at Bruce, "but I don't believe anybody is unbeatable." Bruce finally turned toward him. Wallace held his gaze. "Not even Bruce Lee." Silence. Bruce studied him, then asked, "Why?" Wallace blinked. "Why what?" "Why do you need to believe someone can be beaten?" the audience murmured. Wallace smiled. "Because everybody can be beaten." Bruce nodded. "Maybe." Wallace leaned forward. "No." His voice became firmer. "Everybody." Bruce remained calm. Wallace continued. "I respect you." A pause. "But I don't think you're different from the rest of us." Carson looked between them. Bruce slowly smiled. Then came the sentence. Quiet. Almost casual, but devastating. "Then find out." The studio went dead silent. Carson's smile disappeared. Wallace stared at Bruce. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or applaud. Bruce hadn't shouted. He hadn't threatened him. He hadn't even changed his posture. He had simply opened the door. Wallace understood. He stood. The audience reacted immediately. Some people laughed. Others applauded. Carson raised both hands. "Gentlemen." Wallace smiled. "Relax, Johnny." He looked at Bruce. "Just a little demonstration." Bruce stood. Now the two men were facing each other. The laughter was gone. The studio suddenly felt smaller. Carson glanced toward the cameras. The cameras remained fixed on them. Nobody knew whether this was still part of the show. Wallace stepped forward. Bruce didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. Wallace smiled. "You ready?" Bruce answered softly. "I've been ready." A murmur moved through the audience. Wallace lifted his hands. Bruce's hands remained loose. That surprised Wallace. Most fighters prepared themselves visibly. Bruce didn't. His shoulders were relaxed. His breathing was steady. His eyes were moving. Not randomly. They were studying Wallace. His feet, his hips, his shoulders, his balance. Wallace noticed. He shifted his weight slightly. Bruce's eyes followed. Wallace shifted again. Bruce noticed again. Wallace smiled. "You watching my feet?" Bruce answered. "I'm watching you." The audience laughed. Wallace shook his head. Then everything changed. He moved. Fast. A sudden kick shot forward. The audience gasped. But Bruce wasn't there. He had moved just outside the line of attack. Barely. No dramatic leap. No desperate retreat. Just a small shift. Wallace recovered immediately. His eyes narrowed. Bruce was still standing there. Calm. Wallace attacked again. Faster. Bruce moved. Wallace changed direction. Bruce moved again. The audience began to realize what they were watching. Wallace wasn't slow. He wasn't missing because he lacked skill. He was missing because Bruce wasn't where he expected him to be. Wallace stopped. Bruce stopped. They stared at each other. The room was silent again. Wallace took a breath, then smiled. "Okay." He attacked again. This time the movement was sharper. A feint. A kick. Another movement behind it. Bruce slipped away from the first, turned around the second, and escaped the third. The audience erupted. Carson stared from a few feet away. He had expected a demonstration. Now he was watching two fighters measure each other. Wallace tried again. Bruce kept moving. But Bruce wasn't simply running. He was controlling distance. Every time Wallace moved forward, Bruce changed the space between them. Every time Wallace changed rhythm, Bruce adjusted. Every time Wallace prepared an attack, Bruce seemed to notice something before the attack began. Wallace stopped. He looked at Bruce. Bruce looked back. Wallace suddenly realized something. Bruce wasn't fighting his kicks. He was fighting the decision that came before the kick. That was different. Wallace had spent years learning how to make his movements fast. Bruce was studying why he moved. Wallace changed tactics. He feinted. Bruce didn't react. Another feint. Nothing. Wallace changed his angle. Bruce shifted one foot. Wallace saw it. He attacked immediately. Bruce stepped away. Wallace followed. Bruce turned. Wallace attacked again. And then Bruce disappeared inside the distance. One moment Wallace was attacking. The next, Bruce was directly in front of him. A hand stopped inches from Wallace's chest. Everything froze. Wallace's eyes widened. The audience gasped. Carson didn't move. Bruce held the position for less than a second, then lowered his hand and stepped backward. He hadn't hit him. He hadn't needed to. The message was clear. The opening was there. Wallace knew it. Bruce knew it. And now the audience had seen it. Bruce extended his hand. "You're fast." Wallace looked at him. For the first time that evening, the confidence in his face had changed, not disappeared. Changed. He had expected speed. He had expected technique. What he hadn't expected was control. Wallace looked at Bruce's hand, then accepted it. "And you're faster than I expected." The audience exploded into applause. Carson finally laughed. He walked toward them. "I thought this was a talk show," the audience roared. Bruce smiled. Wallace laughed. The tension broke. The band played. The cameras pulled back. For everyone watching at home, it looked like a perfect television moment. Two martial artists had exchanged a few movements. Nobody had been hurt. Nobody had officially won. And Carson had delivered the perfect punchline. But there was something the audience didn't know. Something the cameras couldn't show. Bruce Lee had not been trying to prove he was faster. He had been studying Wallace, and Wallace had just realized it. Carson returned to his desk. He looked at both men. "Well, gentlemen." The audience quieted. "Who won?" Laughter filled the studio. Wallace looked at Bruce. Bruce looked at Wallace. Then Bruce turned toward Carson. A small smile appeared. "Tonight?" He paused. "Television." The audience erupted. Carson laughed. The band played. Bruce smiled. Wallace shook his head. For a few seconds, everything looked normal again. But then the camera light changed. The segment was ending. The audience began settling for the next guest. Crew members moved across the stage. The bright energy of the show started to disappear. Bruce turned toward the backstage hallway. Wallace watched him leave. Then something bothered him. He had been challenged. He had attacked. He had tested Bruce. But he still didn't have the answer he wanted. Could Bruce Lee actually beat him? Wallace stood. He followed. Not toward the audience. Not toward Carson. Toward the hallway behind the studio. The cameras stayed behind. The laughter stayed behind. The television show stayed behind. Now there were only two fighters. Wallace caught up with Bruce. "Bruce." Bruce stopped. He turned. Wallace walked closer. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Wallace asked quietly, "You knew?" Bruce looked at him. "Knew what?" "Where I was going." Bruce smiled. "No." Wallace frowned. Bruce continued, "I knew where you wanted to go." Wallace stared at him. What's the difference? Bruce's expression became serious. The difference, he paused, is everything. Wallace remained silent. Bruce turned toward the hallway. Then Wallace asked the question that had been waiting inside him since the moment they faced each other. If that had been real, Bruce stopped. Wallace continued. What would you have done? Bruce slowly turned around. For the first time that night, his smile disappeared completely. He looked directly into Wallace's eyes. Then he said, "That depends on what you did next." Wallace didn't answer, because suddenly he understood. Bruce had never been waiting for his attack. He had been waiting for his mistake. And that meant the confrontation on stage might not have been a test of speed at all. It might have been a test of awareness. The cameras had captured the movement. The audience had captured the applause. Carson had captured the joke. But nobody had captured what mattered most. The look in Bruce Lee's eyes just before Wallace attacked. Because in that instant, Bruce had already seen something. Something Wallace himself hadn't realized he was revealing. And now, backstage, Bruce was about to explain exactly what it was. Wallace waited. Bruce took a slow breath, then said, "You were fast." A pause. "But before you moved," Bruce looked directly into his eyes. "You told me what you were going to do." Wallace's face changed. The hallway became silent. And suddenly, the question wasn't who would win. The question was much more dangerous. How much had Bruce Lee already understood before the fight even began? The answer was about to change everything. This is a cinematic, fictionalized continuation based on the premise provided, not a verified historical account. Bill Wallace had one question left. If that had been a real fight, what would you have done? Bruce Lee looked at him for several seconds. Then he answered quietly, "I wouldn't have fought your kick." Wallace frowned. "Then what would you have fought?" Bruce took a step closer. "The moment before your kick." Wallace's expression changed. Bruce continued, "You gave me your attack before you gave me your kick." For the first time that night, Wallace had nothing to say. The cameras were gone. The audience was gone. There was no Johnny Carson to turn the tension into a joke. Just two fighters standing in a quiet backstage hallway. Wallace crossed his arms. "You saw it that quickly?" Bruce nodded. "Your shoulder moved first. Then your hips. Your weight changed. Even your eyes told me where you wanted to go." Wallace shook his head. "You were watching all that?" Bruce smiled. "I was watching you." That answer hit harder than Wallace expected, because Bruce hadn't been trying to outrun him. He had been studying him. Every movement Wallace made had given Bruce information. Every feint, every shift, every hesitation. Wallace looked toward the studio. "So when I attacked," Bruce nodded. "You had already decided where you were going." Wallace smiled. "That's what fighters do." "Yes," Bruce paused. "But good fighters hide it." Silence. Wallace looked at him. "And you?" Bruce's expression remained calm. "I try not to decide too early." Wallace understood. Bruce wasn't waiting for a specific attack. He was waiting for the moment to reveal itself. That was why his movements had looked so effortless. He wasn't guessing. He was adapting. Wallace wasn't satisfied. "Suppose I hadn't been testing you." Bruce waited. "Suppose I really wanted to hit you." Bruce nodded. "What would you do?" Bruce answered, "Adapt." Wallace laughed. "That isn't an answer." "It is." "No. I want to know who would win." Bruce smiled. "That depends." "On what?" "On what happens next." Wallace shook his head. "You always avoid the easy answer." Bruce looked directly into his eyes. "Easy answers are dangerous." Wallace became silent. Bruce continued, A fighter who believes he already knows the result stops seeing what is happening. He paused. The moment you think you have won. Bruce looked toward the empty studio. You become vulnerable. Wallace slowly nodded. Now he understood. Bruce wasn't obsessed with proving himself. He was obsessed with remaining prepared. And that made him harder to read than any opponent Wallace had expected. A stage manager appeared at the end of the hallway. Bill, you're needed back on stage. Wallace nodded. Before returning, he looked at Bruce. One last question. Bruce waited. Could I beat you? Bruce smiled. Maybe. Wallace laughed. You really won't give me an answer? Bruce shook his head. Because there isn't one. They returned to the stage. The audience applauded. Johnny Carson looked relieved. Well, I'm glad you're both still standing. The crowd laughed. Carson turned toward Wallace. So, Bill, did you learn anything? Wallace looked at Bruce, then smiled. Yes. Carson leaned forward. What? Wallace pointed toward Bruce. That he's very annoying. The audience exploded with laughter. Bruce laughed too. Carson looked at Bruce. And what did you learn? Bruce smiled. That Bill is very fast. Wallace nodded. Thank you. Bruce added, but speed isn't everything. The audience laughed. Wallace shook his head. There it is. Carson looked between them. I'm beginning to think I should never put you two in the same room again. The audience roared. But behind the laughter, Wallace understood something important. He had entered the studio wanting to test Bruce Lee. Instead, Bruce had forced him to examine himself. Not his strength, not his speed, his habits, his intentions, his mind. Eventually, the show ended. The audience left. The cameras switched off. The lights began to fade. The famous Carson stage became almost completely empty. Wallace approached Bruce one final time. I came here thinking I needed to test you. Bruce smiled. And? Wallace extended his hand. I think you tested me. Bruce accepted it. They shook hands. No cameras, no applause, just respect. Wallace smiled. Next time, I won't show you what I'm thinking. Bruce laughed. You already did. Wallace stared at him. Bruce continued. You showed me the moment you decided to attack. Wallace shook his head. You really watch everything. Bruce smiled. That's the point. Wallace turned to leave, then stopped. Bruce. Bruce looked back. If that had been a real fight. He paused. Would you have been afraid? Bruce's expression became serious. Yes. Wallace looked surprised. Bruce continued. Fear isn't the problem. A pause. The problem is when fear stops you from seeing clearly. Wallace nodded. Bruce walked toward the exit, then stopped one final time. Without turning around, he said, The dangerous fighter isn't the man who feels no fear. He paused. It's the man who can feel it and still think. The door closed. Wallace remained alone. The studio was silent. The audience would remember the jokes. They would remember Carson. They would remember the moment the two fighters faced each other. But Wallace would remember something else. Bruce hadn't tried to prove he was unbeatable. He had simply refused to be predictable. And perhaps that was the real lesson. The audience thought they had watched a fight. Bill Wallace knew they had watched something else. A lesson. But there was still one sentence Bruce had left unsaid. One sentence that would haunt Wallace long after the cameras were gone. Because just before Bruce disappeared through the door, he had turned back and said, Next time, don't show me your intention. Wallace smiled. Then Bruce added, Because next time, I might not stop. The cameras were off. The audience was gone. Johnny Carson's famous stage was almost completely empty. But Bill Wallace was still standing there. He couldn't stop thinking about one sentence. Next time, I might not stop. It wasn't a threat. That was what made it powerful. Bruce Lee had said it calmly, almost gently. And now Wallace understood something he hadn't understood when he walked onto the stage. Bruce hadn't been trying to prove that he was unbeatable. He had been trying to understand him. And somehow, that was more intimidating. Wallace looked toward the exit. Bruce was already gone. But the question remained. What would have happened if they had actually fought? For years, fighters had argued about questions like that. Who was faster? Who was stronger? Who had better technique? Who would win? But Bruce Lee understood something most people didn't. A real fight doesn't care about reputation, doesn't care about applause. It doesn't care about what people said yesterday. One moment can change everything. One mistake, one hesitation, one step in the wrong direction. And suddenly, the man everyone believed would win is on the ground. That was why Bruce refused to give Wallace an answer. Not because he was afraid, because he respected uncertainty. Wallace finally walked toward the exit. He passed the empty chairs, the dark cameras, the silent stage. Everything that had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier now looked completely different. He stopped near the edge of the stage. For a moment, he remembered the first attack. The speed, the movement, the instant Bruce disappeared from the line of attack. And then something occurred to him. Bruce hadn't looked surprised, not even once. Wallace had been moving as quickly as he could, but Bruce's eyes had remained calm, almost as if he had been waiting. Wallace whispered to himself. "What did you see?" There was no answer, only silence. Then Wallace smiled, because perhaps he finally understood. Bruce had never promised to be unbeatable. He had never said he would win. He had never claimed to be the fastest man alive. Other people had created those stories. Bruce had simply created his own philosophy. Adapt. Don't become trapped by one technique. Don't become trapped by one rhythm. Don't become trapped by one expectation. Because the moment you become predictable, someone else controls you. Wallace knew that lesson now, and he knew exactly where he had learned it. Under the bright lights of Johnny Carson's studio. The next morning, the story was already being discussed. People remembered the laughter. They remembered Carson's jokes. They remembered the two martial artists facing each other. Some people believed it had been nothing more than television. Others believed there had been genuine tension. And everyone had the same question. Who would have won? But there was no official answer. No scoreboard, no referee, no winner announced. And perhaps that was exactly why the story became so memorable. Because the audience was left to decide. Bruce Lee, Bill Wallace, speed against timing, technique against unpredictability, confidence against calm. But Wallace knew something the audience didn't. He had stood directly in front of Bruce. He had attacked. He had tested him, and Bruce had shown him an opening without ever needing to exploit it. That mattered, because the easiest thing in the world for a fighter is to hurt someone. The harder thing is knowing when not to. Bruce had stopped, not because he couldn't continue, because he chose not to. And that choice told Wallace more about him than any demonstration could have. Later, Wallace would think about that night differently. At first, he had believed the important question was, can Bruce Lee beat me? But eventually, he realized that was the wrong question. The better question was, what happens when two fighters refuse to fight the way the other expects? That was where Bruce had been different. He didn't want to fight Wallace's game. He didn't want to prove he could beat Wallace at kicking. He didn't want to beat speed with speed. He wanted to remove the assumptions. That was Bruce's real advantage. Not simply speed, not simply strength, not simply technique. Adaptability. Wallace understood it, and that understanding stayed with him. Imagine the scene again. The empty Carson studio. One spotlight still glowing. Bruce Lee walking toward the exit. Bill Wallace standing behind him. No audience, no cameras, no laughter. Just two fighters who had begun the night as strangers. Wallace called out, "Bruce." Bruce turned. Wallace smiled. "You know what?" Bruce waited. "I still think I could beat you." Bruce smiled. "I hope so." Wallace laughed. "Why?" Bruce answered, "Because if you stop believing in yourself, you're already finished." Wallace became serious. Bruce continued, "But don't confuse confidence with certainty." Wallace nodded. "What do you mean?" Bruce looked at him. "Confidence says, I'm prepared." He paused. "Certainty says, I know what will happen." Bruce shook his head. "You should never believe you know what will happen." Wallace smiled. "That's your philosophy?" Bruce nodded. "That's fighting." A long silence followed. Then Wallace extended his hand again. Bruce accepted it. This time, neither man needed to say anything. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it meant more than the confrontation on stage, because there was no audience to impress, no reputation to defend, no cameras to perform for. Only respect. Then Wallace asked one final question. "Why did you stop?" Bruce looked at him. "Stop what?" "The strike." Bruce knew exactly what he meant. "You were close." Wallace nodded. "You could have continued." Bruce smiled. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Bruce took a breath. "Because you already understood." Wallace frowned. "Understood what?" "That I could reach you." Silence. Bruce continued. "Once you know that," he paused, "there's nothing left to prove." Wallace looked down. That answer stayed with him, because it changed the meaning of victory. Maybe victory wasn't always putting someone on the ground. Maybe victory was having complete control and choosing not to use it. The studio lights finally went dark, one by one. The stage disappeared into shadow. The place where hundreds of people had been laughing became completely silent. Bruce Lee walked through the exit. Wallace followed a few moments later, and the night ended. But the lesson remained. Years later, people could still argue about who would have won. They could compare speed, technique, timing, experience. They could replay the imagined confrontation endlessly. But there was one fact nobody could argue with. When the moment became serious, Bruce Lee remained calm, and Bill Wallace respected it. That was the real ending. Not a knockout. Not a victory celebration. Not a defeated opponent. Two fighters walking away with a deeper understanding of each other. Because sometimes the most powerful fight is the one that never needs to happen. And yet, there was still one final mystery. Something Wallace would remember. Something that had happened after the cameras stopped. Just before Bruce walked away, Wallace had asked, "If we ever really fought, would you be afraid?" Bruce had answered, "Yes." Wallace had been surprised, but Bruce explained, "Fear is information." Wallace stared at him. Bruce continued, "When you feel fear, your body is telling you something." He pointed toward his chest. "Listen." Then toward his eyes. "Observe." Then toward the floor. "Adapt." Bruce looked directly at Wallace. "Don't let fear make your decisions." Wallace nodded. Bruce turned to leave, then stopped. One final sentence. One sentence that Wallace would never forget. The fighter who controls himself doesn't need to control his opponent. And then Bruce walked away. The door closed. Silence. The next day, television viewers remembered the comedy. They remembered Johnny Carson. They remembered Bruce Lee's smile. They remembered Bill Wallace's confidence. They remembered the moment the two men faced each other. But they didn't know what had really happened. They didn't know that behind the cameras, the conversation had become something deeper. It wasn't about proving who was better. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about winning. It was about understanding what makes a fighter dangerous. And perhaps that is why the story remained powerful. Because the most dangerous person in a room isn't always the biggest. It isn't always the strongest. It isn't always the fastest. Sometimes, it's the person who remains calm when everyone else loses control. The person who watches instead of reacts. The person who adapts instead of insisting. The person who doesn't need applause to know who they are. That night, Bill Wallace came looking for a challenge. Instead, he found a lesson. And Bruce Lee? He walked away without declaring himself the winner, because he didn't need to. The final image is the empty Carson stage. The chairs are gone. The audience is gone. The cameras are dark. Only one spotlight remains. It slowly fades. Black screen. The narrator's voice returns. That night, Bill Wallace wanted to know if Bruce Lee could be beaten. A pause. But Bruce Lee never gave him the answer. Another pause. Instead, he gave him something far more valuable. Silence. Then, a reason to stop asking who would win, and start asking who would still be standing when everything went wrong. The screen remains black. Then one final line appears. Because the greatest fighter isn't the one who knows he will win. A beat. It's the one who is ready for whatever happens next. Fade out. And somewhere beyond the studio lights, two fighters walk away in opposite directions. No winner. No loser. Only respect. But if there was one thing Bill Wallace knew for certain after that night, it was this. Bruce Lee had never needed to prove he was unbeatable. He only needed to remain unpredictable. And that was far more dangerous.